Welcome to the Third Man. I am your host, the man which is uninformed. So we are going to review a video on Romans 4 by a Roman Catholic, and I'll start rolling on the tape. So the Roman Catholic apologist that we'll be reviewing today is, his name is, quote-unquote, How to Be Christian. And he's quite popular among some groups, mainly little conservative Catholics on the internet. And that's fine. Everybody has their niche. So I'm going to now play his video. He's responding to a reviewer, or commenter, rather, on his video. And let's just review it.
He says, would love some insight on Romans 4, 1 through 12. We asked him to be a little more specific and said, what questions do you have about Romans 4, 1 through 12? And William said, well, it specifically says that Abraham was justified by faith, not by works, and it doesn't specify of the law after that word works. And William points out that this argument seems to be used by a fair amount of Protestants. So that's a good question from William, and that verse does tend to be used by a fair amount of Protestants because it doesn't have that of the law after it. And we have a video on works of the law. The link to that is in the description, also up here in the card. So it's easier for Protestants to trick Christians with that because it doesn't have the of the law. And if the Christian that those Protestants are talking to has not read Romans, then this argument that William is bringing up here could end up tricking you. So anyway, someone here asked William, have you read the book of Romans in context? That's always a good idea, especially when you're hearing a Protestant jump to a specific text in an attempt to try to make it sound like it's proving their point. As we see time and time again here, Protestants are always just going to specific verses or specific passages and just ignoring the context. Because when you add context to the verses, they never teach Protestantism. Check out our series, Christian versus Protestant. You'll see it a lot. They'll go to specific verses, out of context, put it in context, doesn't say what they're saying anymore. We got a list of that playlist up here in the card. Anyway, what Protestants do is they go to Romans 4. They say, hey, look, it says work here. That must mean all works. Already that doesn't make sense because if you go to Ephesians 2, we can learn that God did work to save people. So clearly this can't be teaching that no works are necessary to be saved because God's work is necessary to be saved. So when you bring that up with a Protestant, they'll have to say, yeah, okay, I understand God's work saves us, but this work is talking about all of our work. So I'm not saying all works, including God's works. I'm just saying it's all of our work. And they might think they just saved themselves, but actually they just prove that that work there isn't defined. At least not by that passage alone, because that passage doesn't say that this is not talking about all works. But we can read other passages like Ephesians 2 and find out, okay, well, we can't possibly be talking about all works because God's work does save us. So when a Protestant admits that, then they've already proven that Romans 4 is unclear as to what this work means. Now that alone does not prove that the Protestant side is wrong, and it also doesn't prove that the Christian side is right. So how can we find out what this works here is talking about? We can just back it up a chapter, and it's very clearly talking about works of the law, and specifically circumcision. You go to the next chapter, they're still talking about circumcision. So what do you think that the work that they're talking about here is referring to? We already know it's not all works because God has done work to save people. So chances are it's probably talking about the same works that were just being discussed in Romans 3, the works of the law, specifically circumcision. Because at the start of Romans 4, we're still talking about some kind of work, and we're specifically talking about circumcision. So next time you hear a Protestant trying to use Romans 4 to try to say that faith alone and no works will save you, you could just introduce them to a little friend called context. Who's a good boy? All right, after that was explained to William, he said, very helpful, thank you very much for the thoughts. Eagerly anticipating a new upload. Of course, the new upload is just answering the same thing we already answered for William, so sorry, William, that this is not really any new information for you. Maybe next time. Again, if anyone else is looking to get excommunicated, just leave your X in the comments below.
That's pretty much summarizes the argument pretty well. There's no reason to continue with the video. So for those suffering from sleep deprivation or just they don't listen very well, I'm going to summarize the argument just a little bit so that you grasp it. It's very simple. In Romans 4, it's not talking about human works in general. Rather, it's talking about works of the law. And mainly, there seems to be a focus on things to obtain Jewish identity. that being circumcision or whatever the works. That's what Paul has in focus. So we could just put in and insert that Roman Catholic laws are perfectly fine. We have the new law, the law of Christ, or whatever the Roman Catholic presents as their position. Now, this interpretation has some difficulties, to say the least. Let's just go through a few of the objections to such an interpretation and see if if it holds water. To look at the passage, what then are we to say about Abraham, our human ancestor? For if Abraham was justified by actions, works, he would have had something to boast about, though not before God. For what does Scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Now, to someone who works, wages are not considered a gift, but an obligation. However, to someone who does not work, but simply believes in the one who justifies the ungodly, his faith is credited as righteousness. Likewise, David also speaks of the blessedness of the person whom God regards as righteous, apart from actions. Now, this translation is a little biased, but why does it go that way? Why do these translators decide to translate it this way instead of the other ways? It's very simple. One of the reasons works are being referred here in general, I believe, is because it's in reference to Abraham. Now, I'm no historian, but basically, if you're familiar with the biblical timeline, Abraham comes before Moses. Well, what's the relevance of that? Well, the relevance of that is that the law of Moses, in fact, comes at Moses' time. That's why we call it that. So it's hard to believe that Abraham would have been obeying that. There are some Jewish traditions that might suggest so, but there's no reason for us to believe that, especially given Paul's own chronology. We have Romans 5 and Galatians 3, which teach that the law came down after and came at the time of Moses, not in the time of Abraham. There are references to laws in Genesis, but those laws are thought to just be general commands of God, just like sacrificing Isaac, or whatever, the likes of which happens in the discourse between Genesis 12 and 22. So, to me, this interpretation already seems fishy and not persuasive, given that it doesn't grasp the biblical timeline. Secondly, Abraham is being paralleled to David, or at least they're being both given as case examples of this principle Paul's teaching. And David himself is not being chastised, or how shall I say this? He's not being brought up as an example of someone not circumcised or something, or of the like, or didn't take Jewish identity. Rather, what's being referred to is his sins with Bathsheba, which are, adultery and murder of Uriah the Hittite. So it's pretty bad. Those are going beyond Jewish identity now, things that Catholics would consider the moral law found in the Mosaic law, and continued on in the law of Christ, or the new law, the law of the gospel, as they put it in their catechism. So it seems to me that we have a clear contradiction once again. We have the Bible teaching on the one hand that people are not justified via these good deeds or their bad deeds, but rather that they're justified merely by faith. So it seems that this has already put the Roman Catholic at a disadvantage. I was also surprised to find that he did not object to the Protestant belief that this refers to forensic language. That seems to be the common Roman Catholic objection, but he seems to accept that. So we can take that for granted, I guess. He doesn't, or at least he didn't openly contest it. Maybe in another video he would challenge that assumption or belief. I don't think it's an assumption. I think there are very good reasons to believe that the righteousness and justification language is forensic, which means this is kind of language of legality. Imagine like a divine court, where a sinner comes in and whether God declares them righteous or guilty. Think about the language of imputation and things like that. So, and just because the prior chapter is about works of the law, well, that doesn't mean Paul can't narrow his usage to display a point. I think another reason for thinking it's about works in general is the principle he takes from just human experience. Now, to someone who works, wages are not considered a gift, but an obligation. So I think that's more about works in general. That would fit better with that interpretation, because it isn't merely like works of circumcision that you think that would be about, but general good deeds is what you really think that's really about. you don't think you only deserve things in reference to Jewish boundary markers. It would be hard to maintain that, in my opinion. So, what else may be a issue for the Roman Catholic interpretation? I would say is that they have to posit what I would consider a massively deficient understanding of the covenants through time, or at least a deficient understanding of how people are justified their different ages. And what do I mean by that? Well, clearly, Paul has the assumption of bringing up these historic examples that the way they are saved is in connection in some way we are saved. But one of the, I think, necessary assumptions of the Roman Catholic in this debate is that there are different ways people have been saved in different dispensations of time. Why do I think that? Well, just think right now. People are saved clearly differently than the Old Testament. There's a sacramental system. There's the Eucharist. There's the confession. There's when I say confession, I mean articular confession. There's baptism. There's various sacraments that are necessary for salvation that couldn't have been instituted in the Old Testament, and that's essential to the Roman Catholic program. So, where's the rub between that idea and what I just said? Well, the rub here is this. Paul presents that there's some way that Abraham and David's salvation is connected to our salvation. But on their schema, there's a necessary disconnect between the way that they were all saved and the way we are saved. Namely, that we have all these new requirements. But is that, and well, I think they're undercutting to the Roman Catholic position, because if human beings have been saved the same way throughout all ages, then Roman Catholicism is necessarily false. Because Roman Catholicism posits a new way of salvation given the new covenant, and that being the sacramental system itself. Where does this text teach that, though? Well, my argument is that it's a presumption of Paul here that we are saved the same way Abraham and David are saved, and that's why they can be used as examples of our justification, and that's the whole point. And that doesn't flow only into this text. That flows into Romans 9, where God teaches that there's been this elect group of people throughout all times. And I think that is good evidence to suppose that we're saved the same way. And I think in Galatians 3, when it teaches that the law was never meant to give life, it seems to me, and that life is only acquired by faith. Well, that means that they've been saved the same way as we are, and that's why it speaks about God revealing the gospel to Abraham in Genesis 12 and various things like that. This is good reason to suppose that there is what Protestants have usually labeled a covenant of grace, or as later on with New Covenant thinkers is saying, one way of salvation. It seems to me that is clearly the biblical position, and the Roman Catholic has just got the short end of the stick given their traditions. There also seems to me still this question of what is the Roman Catholic view of the law in the New Testament. I know they speak about the law of Christ and so forth, but I wonder to what difference is that really to say that they don't prescribe some Mosaic laws. Obviously, there's things like circumcision, food requirements, and such that they don't require. But there are moral prescriptions in the law of Moses. So why would they say it's fine to prescribe any of those for justification now, even though and say they want to say it's just merely that the law of Christ is required? Well, what's the difference if the law of Christ still carries over some of those old Mosaic prescriptions, like no bestiality, against adultery, and things like that? It seems to me that the Roman Catholic view isn't very clear on why that is. It seems to be actually no different in the end, in some regard. I mean, not doing everything in the Mosaic law, but certain laws, making them required, seems to be no significant difference, even if you just reduce it to the moral law, or whatever categorizations you want to put. Seems like if it's any works, which they do require those things, it seems like if it's any works of the law whatsoever, that the Roman Catholic position has a problem, which they do require those things. If you do those sins, they are mortal sins, right? Not venial sins, but mortal sins. They destroy the grace of justification. So it seems to me that the Roman Catholics still, in some regard, would say that the laws of Moses, even if they're under the headship now of the law of Christ, so to speak, are obligatory for justification. So how do they kind of deal with that kind of objection? Because it's a bit confusing to me, at least. Maybe I just don't understand it. That's not a knockdown argument, but that's just food for thought for any Catholic watching the video. Well, thanks for tuning in. Come back anytime, and goodbye.